Hi there, today I want to talk about proclaiming the gospel with courage. I wonder how you feel when you go out and proclaim the gospel, or even when you're thinking about sharing the gospel with somebody. Maybe you go out your front door and you see a neighbour in the street and you have that moment, should I engage them or not? And possibly fear might fill your heart and you might be tempted to draw back because you feel fearful and you feel weak. I know I've had times like that before where I've drawn back because I feel fearful and I feel weak. And I think to myself, if I can get over this feeling of fear and if I can get over this feeling of weakness, then I'll go and proclaim the gospel. There's this sense that we have to have a boldness and a courage before we go and proclaim Christ. And for many of us, that is a barrier to us going and sharing the gospel because we never feel courageous and we never feel bold. Well, I just want to share with you an insight from Paul's time in Corinth. Do you remember Paul when he was at Corinth? He goes and he gets a job tent making and he's in the synagogue every Sabbath proclaiming the word of the Lord, and then they kick him out of the synagogue, or at least tensions start to get a little bit heated, and Paul leaves the synagogue and then he goes and he takes up residence at someone's house who lives next door to the synagogue. He starts testifying to the non-Jews about Jesus being the Christ. He gets more opposition. At the same time, he's seeing people being saved, and he stays there for 18 months. And God speaks to him and says, Paul, don't be silent, go on speaking. The only reason the Lord had to say that to Paul was because Paul was getting opposition, and clearly he was tempted to draw back, as sometimes we are. We get tempted to draw back from proclaiming Christ. And maybe you think about Paul and you think, wow, I wish I could be like him. I wish I could be as bold and courageous. And if only I could get to that point, then I would go and share the gospel. Well, I just want to let you know today, you don't have to get to the point of being completely without fear or without the feeling of weakness before you go and proclaim Christ. This is what Paul said to the Corinthians when he wrote, reflecting on his time in Corinth. He said in 1 Corinthians 2:3, and I was with you in weakness and in fear and much trembling, and my speech and message were not in plausible words of wisdom. Maybe when you think of the Apostle Paul, this super apostle we might think of him as, you think of a guy who's brash and bold and kind of struts into the synagogue and just takes up the podium, and he starts proclaiming the gospel without any fear at all. Paul reflects on himself and he says, no, I was there with weakness, I was fearful and I was trembling. But the thing with Paul is, in spite of his weakness and fear and trembling, he proclaimed the gospel anyway. Paul didn't wait until he had all the right words. Paul didn't wait until he felt an absence of fear. Paul didn't wait until any nerves were gone. Paul was shaken, he was fearful, but he did it anyway. Why is that? Because love compelled Paul. Love for God and love for people compelled him beyond any fear to proclaim the gospel. And so my encouragement to you today is, don't wait until you're without fear or without the feeling of nervousness before you go and proclaim Christ. Whenever I go out and preach and do street preaching or door to door, whatever I do, often I feel weak. 99 times out of 100 I feel weak. And I feel fearful at times. The unknown, not knowing what's going to come against me, not knowing if I'm going to have the words to speak. But faith pushes beyond that fear and proclaims Christ anyway. Faith is obedient to the Lord in spite of how we feel. It's not that we wait until we feel good before we go and proclaim Christ. We proclaim Christ regardless. And as we do that, we know the presence of God with us and we know the joy of obeying him. So that's my encouragement to you today. When you go out of your front door and you see a neighbour and you're in two minds whether or not to engage with them and connect and start sharing Christ, don't draw back until you feel like you've got it all together. Just go and do it anyway and trust the Lord. And I promise the presence of God will be with you as you do that, if you're doing it with the right motives. So I pray in Jesus' name you'd be emboldened today, that you'd be courageous today, and you'd push through the feeling of fear and trembling and proclaim Christ regardless. God bless you.